Welcome to Trashmagination, a podcast about reimagining trash. I'm Carla Brown. Today's episode is about how I do fundraising with scrap quilts and how my approach is different from how many other quilters fundraise with quilts. This episode would be helpful for anyone who wants to fundraise for a cause. If you search on Pinterest for fundraising quilts, most involve selling raffle tickets or selling the quilt in an auction. With raffles, ticket buyers are anonymous, and with auctions, that only allows one person to give money for the quilt. In my opinion, neither of those two options build community. My fundraising quilts have two goals. Yes, raising money, but also growing community. To achieve those goals, I ensure that each supporter is acknowledged within the quilt design. And when the project starts, I don't know how many people are going to participate. I don't know if the quilt will have 10 blocks or 100 blocks. It just depends on the number of donations that we receive. I just love the suspense. I love that the quilt is going to grow as the fundraiser grows. When I did my first fundraising quilt project, we set a minimum donation to be acknowledged on the quilt. And since then, I have learned that it is better to let people donate whatever they are moved to donate. When you leave it open-ended, I find that people donate far more money. In my later fundraising quilt projects, people donated hundreds and thousands of dollars. They might have donated those amounts anyway because they really love the mission of the organization, but the quilt was the reason why they donated now. Some raffle and auction quilts are made by more than one person, and so they do have a function of building a community of makers. For example, sometimes members of a quilt guild will each sew a block, and then someone sews them all together into a quilt. Or at a school, maybe each student will dip fabric into dye, and then a quilter will sew them into a beautiful quilt. And those are really fun projects. But my goal is to build a community of donors for an organization. My first fundraising quilt was in 1998 for an organization called the Peace and Environment Resource Center in Ottawa, Canada. The quilt featured a tree trunk, and each donor had their name sewed on a tree leaf. My second fundraising quilt was in 2017. As I mentioned in previous podcast episodes, I am a member of a taiko or Japanese drumming group named Nendaiko, and we were invited to perform at the North American Taiko Conference in California. Now, we all live near Washington, D.C., so this was going to be a huge trip, and the goal of our quilt was to offset the costs of our travel expenses. It was also a way to gather our supporters before this milestone performance and in some ways bring them along with us virtually to this event. Now, I just finished my third fundraising quilt, and this was a fundraiser for Lester B. Pearson College in British Columbia, Canada, which I attended 30 years ago. And all the people who graduated with me fundraised for a scholarship for a current student. Another scrap fundraising quilt that I saw was made by a member of the group Quilters Unlimited. She was fundraising for the organization Habitat for Humanity, and she made a block of a house for each donation that she gathered. So now I want to talk about the story of a quilt fundraiser and how best to engage your supporters. Now, I love to quilt, and I also love to share good stories on social media. Social media is the perfect forum for these types of fundraisers. The only way you will get a lot of donations is if you can tell a compelling story over and over again without getting boring. Now, most supporters need to hear about an opportunity to donate many times. They will only see a fraction of the social posts or emails that you send to them because people are really busy. And in many cases, if you just say, please give us money for this very good reason, they will tune it out because they hear messages like that repeatedly, and they won't reward you if you're not more creative. But the absolutely wonderful thing about scrap quilt fundraising social media posts is that the posts never get boring. And why is that? It's because in every post, you are going to unveil a new quilt block. And since every quilt block is different because it represents the person who donated, then every post is intriguing. People are going to wonder, what will this block say? How will this block be more beautiful? How does this block represent the donor? Now, I prefer social media for these campaigns over email marketing. Email marketing is very effective for certain types of messages, but social media is better because you could email your supporters every time there is a new quilt block, but the thing about social media is it's a public forum. People are going to like the quilt block, maybe love the quilt block, and they're going to comment. And if this announcement about the new quilt block is hidden in people's email inboxes, it doesn't feel like a shared experience for your supporter community. It's really important to emphasize to your organization that this is a storytelling campaign, not a fundraising campaign. You will get more donations if you tell better stories. When a donor sends their message to sew, I try to ask follow-up questions. But why did they want that message? And then when I share the photo of the finished quilt block on social media, I can add a better story about that supporter, which will inspire other donors. So for example, on the quilt I just finished, someone requested this very fun message, which was, drink coffee, eat cheese. And in the social media post, of course, people saw the block and it was funny and it would be really nice all on its own. But within the post, I was able to share his favorite cheese, which was a fun tidbit about the whole story. It brings the community closer and it reminds all the other donors that we're all good people, funny people, working together on a mission. Now, part of the reason why these quilts work is because of peer pressure. If we see our friends donating, we think, it appears that all these people who I respect are donating, so I think I will do that as well. The quilt makes it okay to say that you donated, which is not info that you might share otherwise. It just normalizes generosity. And one of the coolest things that I have seen is when friends sponsor a quilt block for their friend. And on the quilt that I just finished, there is a block that was sponsored in honor of one of my classmates who is in very poor health. And our classmates wanted her to be part of this project. And I was really moved that they stepped forward to do that. Another important aspect of fundraising is for the request to be urgent. When there's an oil spill or a natural disaster, it is clear that we must donate urgently. We know people's lives are on the line. However, many other causes do not have this type of urgency. With a fundraising quilt, the bottom line is that you are not going to be sewing this quilt forever. There is going to be a natural end to this project after a reasonable amount of time. And ideally, you're going to set the deadline for that final donation to the quilt to be connected with a logical date. So maybe you need to give the quilt to someone on a specific day, like the day they move into the home that you built for them. Or maybe the scholarship recipient is going to graduate. In that case, the deadline is clear, it builds in a natural urgency, and it will encourage more donors to make their donation today rather than procrastinate. Now that leads me to my next big recommendation. The quilt will encourage more donations if you give the quilt to someone special when it's done. I learned this lesson from Susan Barrett Merrill from Weaving a Life. So I used to organize green lifestyle tours each summer, and in 2013, I was organizing a tour in Maine. And as I was researching places where I could take people on the tour, I learned about Susan. I learned how she teaches weaving by setting up a huge loom and then encouraging a group to weave together. So I brought my tour group to visit Susan, and to start the weaving session, she asked the group if there was someone who would benefit from receiving our weaving at the end. And the group decided to make the weaving for a local couple who had been taking us on trips in the community and teaching us. And during our event, there had been a lot of damage to their downtown store caused by, I think it was a fire. My memory's a bit fuzzy on that. But anyway, so everyone talked about this couple while we were doing the weaving, and we wrote them messages of encouragement on slips of paper that we wove into the piece. And then it just made the whole experience of weaving seem more purposeful and more exciting. And a few days later, we gave them the weaving, and it was very meaningful, both for the couple, but also for the people who had made the weaving. Now, from that event, I learned about the power of making art as a gift of encouragement. So when we did the quilt for my Taiko group, at first, all the donors were asked to just give their names. But then donors started asking if I would include messages of encouragement to our Taiko group for this upcoming performance. And that's a very natural thing for the donors to want to do. That was the purpose of the quilt, was to get us to this performance. And with this most recent quilt, the quilt has become pretty much entirely messages of encouragement because we were raising money for a scholarship and we want to encourage that person to move forward after they graduate and have a great life. By sewing messages of encouragement and giving the quilt to a special recipient, the supporters get to express the feelings that we have when we make a donation to any cause. We want the recipients to know that we care and we wish them the very best in their mission. We would not be donating unless we believed in them. The wonderful thing about these messages of encouragement is that they can be very personal to the donor. They can be in many languages. They can be wise. They can be funny. They can be poetic. In this latest quilt, people also started to request if I would sew small images, like a flower from their country, or a snowflake, a sun, a ball of yarn. Now, why were they requesting these things? At first, I was like, oh my gosh, I do not have time to embroider these images. But I thought about it, and I realized that in some ways, I think the message that they were trying to communicate was that we live in a beautiful world. And even though we are all working hard every day towards this organization's mission, we also need to remember the small, wonderful things in life. And I thought that was just a wonderful sentiment to include in our quilt. You might think that some people would not like to be thanked publicly on a quilt, and some people do want to remain anonymous. But the good news is that if you encourage them to send you alternative ideas than just their name, if you say, hey, you can put a message of encouragement for the recipient, or I can embroider images that represent your identity, then even anonymous supporters can see themselves reflected in the quilt without giving up their privacy. It is really lovely when you can share a photo of the finished quilt in the hands of a special recipient. In the case of my Taiko group, we shared photos of ourselves after the concert in California holding up the quilt. We were just beaming with appreciation, and we sent that to all the donors with handwritten thank yous. So be sure to include a photo like that in your thank yous when the quilt is done. So next, I want to talk about how to make sure this project gets done in a reasonable amount of time. Every quilter has unfinished quilts in their quilting area, and you want to make sure this actually gets done on time. Now, one thing you could do is recruit a team of quilters. You could provide each quilter with a template for a simple block. So, for example, maybe you're fundraising for an organization that helps cats, and you could share a simple block with a cat design. And if you want to make the whole quilt yourself, then my recommendation is to keep the blocks very simple. The first fundraising quilt that I made with the applique leaves was too much work, I would say. The next quilt I made was simple rectangles, and then the quilt I just finished was a hand-stitched English paper-pieced hexagon quilt, which sounds complicated, but the nice thing about that type of work is that you can do it when you're not at a sewing machine, which was great for when I had available time to sew. Now, depending on the size of your blocks, you need to calculate the maximum length of a message that someone could request. Now, I usually say they can say whatever they can in 25 characters, which takes me about 30 minutes to sew. And I sew my letters with embroidery floss. You don't have to use scraps to make these quilts, but I always do because it's a great way to reduce my giant stash of scraps. Plus, this is a podcast about creative reuse, so of course I'm going to encourage you to do that. And I also think that when you tell supporters that this quilt was made with recycled fabrics or fabric scraps, it communicates a culture of frugality and good money management, and you tell them that you're not going to waste their donations. And I think that's a good message for any donor. As I said, the quilt needs to look good with 10 blocks or 100. You have to be optimistic and imagine it might be 100. I usually share the blocks on social media as individual units and not sewn together in their final layout. And that's because I don't know how it's all going to lay out in the end until all the donations come in. Will the quilt be 4 rows of 3 or 6 rows of 5? We don't know. So if I'm short one block to get a nice symmetrical design, I will make a donation on behalf of my parents or my grandmother, that kind of thing, and they get to be on the quilt as well. At the end of the project, be sure to put a label on the back of the quilt with the names of the people who sewed it, as well as the year. And I also think it's helpful to add the reason why it was made. It seems really obvious to you now as you're in the middle of making it, but it's amazing how quickly things can be forgotten within an organization. So on my latest quilt, I made the label into a pocket. And in the pocket, I added a letter with even more information about the blocks. I translated the messages that were not in English, and I explained the significance behind the embroidered images. Now, I know some of you might ask, how did I gather donations for these quilts? Well, the first quilt, it was pre-internet, so those were all cash and check donations. The Tycho quilt, we made a GoFundMe page, and the advantage of GoFundMe is that you can set up the page in only a few minutes, and you don't have to worry about how it works or how to make a fancy website. But the disadvantage of GoFundMe is that they do take a small fee for the donations. Also, I want you to encourage you to make sure you keep that community discussion on your social media page. You don't want to get all lively on the GoFundMe page because you're not going to be there forever just for the length of this campaign. So get people to talk over in a place where you will be after this is over. For the alumni quilt, my college already had an online donation system in place. The alumni relations team would email me when someone from my year donated so I could reach out to them and start their quilt block. Of course, actually, in most cases, the people who donated would message me as soon as they donated or even before they were going to donate because they were excited to be a part of the quilt project. And they wanted me to have their message right away so I could get started on sewing. And most of the communication for that campaign took place within a Facebook group for the people who graduated in my year. If that doesn't already exist for your supporter community, you might consider setting something like that up because in Facebook, at least currently, groups, the posts from groups are given favorable treatment in the algorithm more so than from pages. Now I'll summarize my top 10 recommendations for doing a scrap quilt fundraiser. So first, design a quilt that will look good with 10 donations or 100. Make your quilt from recycled fabric or scraps so that you can communicate a culture of sound money management. Use social media to keep the quilt popping up to your supporters, and it allows them to like and comment on other people's blocks because this builds community and peer pressure and urgency. Post every time you make a new block and remind people how they can support the project and be represented on the quilt as well. It's great if you can have a quilt recipient in mind who represents the organization's mission and you can talk about them throughout the campaign. Tell supporters that they can put their name, a message of encouragement, or a simple embroidered image on their block, if you are able to embroider, of course. Don't set a specific amount that people have to donate in order to be on the quilt. It's better to leave it open-ended. If making a whole quilt seems overwhelming, recruit a team. And also be sure to keep your blocks very simple. Wait until you have made all the blocks before sewing the blocks together into a logical layout. And then add a label on the back of the quilt to document who made it, when it was made, and for what purpose. Here's a final thought about these quilts that I learned recently. These quilts become a time capsule of your organization's supporter community. As time goes by and people pass away, you will see names on the quilt of people who are not with us anymore. And you can run your finger over the stitches that represent their contribution. They loved this organization, and now it is up to us to carry on our mission in their memory. Thank you for listening. Please let me know if you have done a fundraiser with a scrap quilt at trashmagination@gmail.com. Until next time, may you see scrap quilts as a creative way to fundraise for the causes that you care about.